Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Singh-Ray webinar this month. We're going to be talking about water effects with ND filters, and we have a very special guest presenter today, Nikhil Bahl, who is going to talk about some of his experiences with and without filters, and lots of information for you guys tonight as far as when to use the filters, how to set up your shots, and that sort of thing. By way of introduction, Nikhil Bahl is a full-time professional photographer, an author, educator, and environmentalist, and he resides in the Washington, D.C. area. Drawing inspiration from nature, Nikhil adopts novel approaches and seeks meaningful interpretations to create photographs that transcend the commonplace, reflect deeper insights, and convey an enchantment of the subject's beauty. He also aims to portray environmental stories with an artistic appeal, so his photographs educate and motivate about the imperative of conservation. Over the last 10 years, Nikhil has led over 200 workshops and tours in the US and abroad. He is a regular speaker at photography clubs, expos, and industry events, and authored the acclaimed ebook, Creative Interpretations. He also writes articles on the creative and technical aspects of photography. And if you want to find out more about Nikhil and his work, you can go to Nikhil Bahl, NikhilBahl.com. And we'll have that URL up at the end of the presentation as well, so you don't have to worry about jotting that down just yet. And so Nikhil, from this point, we'll let you take it on from here, and if I see some questions in between, I'll interrupt and let you know what they are.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Michelle. Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm gonna kind of go through this in a fashion where I'm kind of going where all this, I've kind of put everything together in terms of subject rather than trying to do it by filter. And the reason for that is there are similarities in the subjects that we're going to look at, and I wanted to kind of illustrate specific points that will help you along the way. So the primary, oops, this is not working. Okay, here we go. The primary points or key points that I will cover are how, why, and when that I use these filters. The camera settings you will find on the right side of the image, so it's there for every image. That way you know what I have used to get that specific effect. The filter I have used is also listed on the right side, so you'll see it on the next slide. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how light affects your choices and how it affects the shutter speed. Of course, picking the right filter is extremely important, and that comes kind of based on several compositional considerations and focal length, etc., etc. So I'm gonna get into the next slide here. So this is not taken with an ND filter, and as you can see on the right side, it says it's a circular polarizer, and those are all the settings below it that you see. So this is kind of a straightforward waterfall shot, and waterfalls, again, depending on how fast the water is moving, generally around 1 to 2 seconds is where I usually start with any waterfall, and it's not hard to get there, especially in overcast light like this particular image, just because you're starting with less light anyway, and this waterfall is kind of tucked into the shade as well, so that helps. So there's no need for me to use an ND filter to slow it down any further. This is another example of just using a simple circular polarizer. Now, when you shoot really early or late in the day, you really don't necessarily need to have an ND filter to get a longer exposure. So here I have a 3-second exposure, and I'm easily able to get some, there's a little waterfall, if you see on the left side, it's McQuay Falls in California, and I'm able to time my exposure so that I can get those waves kind of breaking and pulling back, so I get some of that action on the beach. And so the time of day and the amount of light you have makes a big difference in terms of how long the exposure you're going to get. So the variable ND filter is one of my favorites. And just to give you an idea, the three ND filters that I always have in my bag are the Vari ND, the more slow 5-stop, and the more slow 10-stop. All three are Singh-Ray filters. And I always carry those because I never know what I'm going to need. And I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of those and when I choose to use them. So in this case, this is obviously a fairly bright light, but I'm using the variable ND filter here. And the variable ND filter is 2 to 8 stops. So you get a range, and it's not actually quite precise in terms, there are markings on it, but it's not very precise. It gives you an idea of kind of where you are in terms of how much density you're dialing in. But generally, it's not super accurate, but it's accurate enough so you kind of know where you're at. And so I put the variable ND filter on, and I've got to about 1.6 seconds, which is approximately where I wanted to be. And I talked about that with waterfalls. Generally, 1 to 2 seconds is really a good start. And this is obviously a very fast-moving waterfall in Iceland called Gullfoss. So I took this exposure, and I realized that I really didn't want so much of the sky. It was maybe I wanted to focus more on the water and the mist kind of coming up on the side. So I changed my focal length and kind of zoomed in a little bit. And that automatically, I didn't change anything with my filter. If you notice, the previous one was 1.6 seconds, but this is 2 seconds. And that's simply because one of the brighter parts of the image, which is the sky, is actually been removed from the image or the composition. Thus, the exposure now becomes a little bit longer. And you also notice that I'm shooting at ISO 64, so that's taken on a D810, which is the base ISO. That's generally where I start, and I try and stay there just because that's going to give you the best dynamic range and the best image quality that the camera has to offer. So I generally will take most of my landscape shots at that ISO. And so this is the black and white conversion. So this is coming back a different day. So some days you just don't have the light and the conditions that you need. You saw in the previous 2 photos, those were taken the same day, but they were very different in the sense that there was almost too much light. And I was using the ND filter to slow things down, but the light wasn't working for me. In my opinion, and this is a black and white conversion, I do realize that, but if you go back and I look at the mist, I don't have as much mist. I have a lot more mist here. So the conditions and just being there a little earlier in the morning, a little colder conditions, more mist coming off the water, this just, was the right kind of conditions. And I still used the variable ND filter. Maybe didn't dial in as much density, again keeping it around that 2.5 seconds, and that was good enough for me. And again, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask, when you're deciding on how long to let that go, how many seconds, how many different settings do you go through before you settle on? Well, like you take them back and look at them later, but would you typically sort of pick one setting and then let it go, or do you try 5 or 6?
So there's 2 ways to kind of approach it. One is generally, if you notice that all these photos, these last 3 photos I showed, were all shot at f/16. So f/16, of course, will give you a lot more depth of field, but it automatically slows the shutter speed down if you're keeping the ISO constant. So f/16 and base ISO is kind of where I start and see where the shutter speed is at. And if it is where I want it to be, then great. If not, then I think about which filter I need to put on. And, like with the variable ND filter, I'll start with 2 stops, but do I need to let it be at 2 stops? Or do I need to dial in some more density so that I can slow the shutter speed down? So the other way to kind of look at it is think about, and this kind of comes with experience, is okay, when I look at the scene, I'm like, I need maybe a 10-second exposure or a 20-second exposure to make it like really smooth. So if that's what I want to go for, then I'll kind of keep that in mind while I start to put my settings in. But again, generally, I'm almost always starting at f16 and base ISO. That's kind of my go-to starting point. And then from there, I'll look at the shutter speed and work with that.
Right.
Okay. So that's kind of was the approach with this particular image as well, where I kind of had an idea of what shutter speed or thereabouts I needed to be. And again, f16, ISO 800, threw the variable ND filter on, and I'm able to get the effect that I wanted. Once again, using the variable ND filter, and this is probably the most versatile filter just because of that 2 to 8 stop advantage that it gives you. Because, you know, one of the tough things with the solid filters that you know, 10, for example, just a 10 stop filter. If you put a 10 stop filter on your camera, you can't focus. You can barely see anything if there's a lot of light. So it's almost like you gotta compose everything beforehand. You gotta lock the focus in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with other examples. But you gotta do all of that beforehand, and then kind of put the filter on, and then take the exposure. And with the variable ND filter, with 2 stops of density, it's very easy to kind of, even in low light, I would generally be able to see enough of my subject and be able to focus on what I need to focus as well. In this particular image, all I needed was 1.5 seconds or thereabouts. And I knew I could get there simply by using, again, f16 as my base ISO, which is 64. And so I am using a couple of different cameras. I use it, you know, some of these were taken with a D4 or D5. And everywhere you see ISO 64, I've used the Nikon D810, which is what that base ISO is. So in this particular case, you know, I deliberately went for that 1.6 second kind of exposure because I felt like that's where I was getting the best effect that I wanted. And what was the effect that I wanted? I wanted to get it smooth enough where it looks very soft, but at the same time have enough texture in the streaks of water kind of coming down. And so if you look at the image carefully, you see that. And there's also a little bit of a juxtaposition between the bottom and the top part. The top part looks softer, while the bottom part looks like it has a lot more detail. And that's simply a result of having more rocks and, you know, a more cascading effect at the bottom, while more of that waterfall effect up top. And so I kind of really like that juxtaposition. And from one point of view also, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, why didn't you show the whole waterfall? Well, you don't have to. That's just my way of looking at things. Is I always think that, you know, yeah, you can take a photograph of a waterfall, but how is it any different from the person standing next to you, or the other person that's going to show up the next day, or the person that's photographed it many times before? So sometimes, you know, focusing on the smaller parts of the waterfall can give you a somewhat unique image, even though the waterfall has been photographed a lot.
And one of the attendees wants to know, where was that photo taken?
This one?
Yes.
This is a waterfall called Dynjandi in Iceland. It's in the northern part of Iceland.
Thank you. And then I think you might be covering this in a few slides, but Jerry wants to know, well, he says, the very ND has a halo effect I don't like. Am I using it wrong?
Yes, I actually have images that demonstrate that, and I want to talk about that because that's something that can be very frustrating. But let me address that because I have addressed that later, because I actually have images that show the halo effect that he's talking about.
Sure, we'll come back to that one. And then Carl wants to know, what if you use a lower ISO, like 0.3, 0.7, or 1.0?
Okay, so what he's talking about is the lower ISOs. I mean, generally, like for example, ISO 64, I can actually go as low as, I think it's called ISO 32 really, which is the low version of the ISO. And I use that in a pinch when I really have to get a slightly slower shutter speed. but I don't have a filter to kind of work with. The reason I usually don't use it a lot of the times is because the dynamic range on that is a little different. So let's say you don't change, if you're in manual mode and you don't change the exposure at all you do is change, and let's say I'm sorry, not manual mode, aperture priority, and you've locked in f16, and all you're doing is you're changing your ISO to the low ISO to get a longer shutter speed. You will achieve that. However, if you're pushing your histogram all the way to the right, like most people recommend for raw photography, if you're pushing it all the way to the right, it's very easy to kind of go over and start to getting some of those blinking highlights or that highlight warning. And that's because the dynamic range for that particular image or that particular ISO changes. So that's why I was saying that the best ISO to shoot at is the base ISO. The base ISO is the default ISO that the camera comes at. So in the case of this particular camera, the D810, it's 64. For most cameras, it's 100. And I generally try not to veer away from that just because of that reason, is because it just does change the exposure. And then in the end, when you're adjusting the exposure, somehow it's actually that dynamic range, you're ending up almost at that same shutter speed anyway. So I don't think there's a big advantage, but I do try it sometimes in a pinch. Okay. So in this particular image, it's a little different from this one. This is obviously a close-up, or what I like to call an extract. This is more a typical landscape shot, again, taken in Iceland. This is probably one of the more photographed regions in Iceland. And, I just chose this particular perspective because I wanted to get a more dramatic foreground effect with being very close to the waterfall, and then having Kukkefell, the mountain, in the background. Now, here again, the dynamic range was very important. That's why, again, I've shot this at ISO 64. The reason for that is it actually rendered even darker than it is on the left side of the image in those dark areas, but I was able to process it and pull out a little bit of the detail. You notice I am not pulling out every little bit of detail. I'm still trying to keep it the way it looked like to my eye, and I'm still trying to keep some level of that drama in there. When you pull out all the detail, like a lot of people do, the one thing you lose out is you lose that effect of that fall off. So you see how that fall off with a very dark area, and then you have the waterfall, and then leading back into the mountain. So I didn't want too much attention to be brought to those detail areas, which are currently rendered pretty dark. I'd rather pull the eye through the waterfall and into the background. So again, using a more slow 5-stop filter. Why did I do that? Well, in this case, the variable ND is a slightly thicker filter. So at 17 mm, which is, I was using a 17 to 35 mm lens. At 17 mm, the edges, and I will show you examples of this, the edges of my photograph would get a little bit of a vignette. So you can actually see the edge of the filter, which in this case, I wanted to capture as wide as possible. So I wanted to shoot it at 17 mm, which is why I chose the more slow 5-stop. Because, and again, the 3-second shutter speed is just about where I want it to be. But that's one of the advantages of using the solid filter. It's not as thick. It's very, and I always use the slim filters. Even with the variable, I use the slim filter. So, and that's because I know that, using the slim filters will give me the least amount or no vignetting at all. So in this image, the water effect is kind of somewhat secondary, but it's still a focal point in the image. This is more really about the fall color, and that was the idea. But I also wanted to kind of keep the waterfall as a visual anchor in there, because it is the fall color and the trees are pretty random looking. There's no real order to them. So I felt like having the waterfall gave the image a little more water, and it also, I think, conveyed the way I felt and the situation at that given point of time. Once again, if you look at the settings, f16, ISO 100, that's almost, you'll find that almost every image that I have in there is at those settings. And then when I'm putting the very ND on, then I'm just kind of tweaking a little bit, tweaking the filter and adjusting the density a little bit, whether it's less or more, to get the shutter speed I want. And when I say the shutter speed I want, I kind of have a general idea. So I still go ahead and take a photo at 1 second, 1.5 seconds, and 2 seconds. Why? Because I can still, even though I know from experience, I might like the 1.5 to 2 seconds a little better, I'll still give myself the options, because that fall color is never going to look the same way. The light's never going to be the same. You know, I may come back another time. The water level in the waterfall is going to be different. So when I'm there, I like to give myself a few options, and I always recommend that to people as well. Don't just take one photo if that looks good on your LCD and just walk away. You know, give yourself a few options and make sure you're, you know, working through, you know, where you're focusing, you know, if you have enough depth of field, etc. And that way, you know, you've got the shot.
And then someone asked, are you ever concerned with the lack of sharpness when shooting at f16?
That's a good question. I was actually going to address that at some point. F16, I feel like in what the person is referring to is essentially called diffraction, generally, which starts at just about f16, and at f22 the image starts to look a little softer, so you don't get the visual acuity when you zoom in and look at finer details. F16, I don't worry about it too much. You know, if I'm really concerned with a specific lens, a lot of the lenses I'm using are pro level lenses, so they're very sharp. So at f16, I get enough sharpness. I've never run into an issue with not having enough sharpness. With a consumer lens, maybe shooting at maybe f13, f14, or maybe even f11, if that is a concern, could be done, and you'll get a better result as far as sharpness goes. But the sweet spot for most lenses tends to be in that f8, f11 area, and I usually will push it to f16. But only on rare occasions when I really need to. And again, these are tools that are available to me. So if I need to, I'll go to f22 and take the shot. It does not destroy the image. It's still usable. But if you are really concerned about having the best possible image quality, getting the best sharpness, you know, I would not go beyond f16. I don't have issues at f16. I do see diffraction just starting at f16, but it's never bad enough to stop me from using it at that f-stop.
And then you mentioned using the slim filters, and someone said that the slim filters have no front thread to stack filters. Do you have a way to stack the slim filters?
That's not true of all slim filters. I believe, in fact, the Singh-Ray filters I got, and I know I think they make two different ones, if I'm not mistaken, one that has the thread and one that doesn't. And or maybe they didn't before and now they do, I'm not sure. That would be a question that somebody on their staff could answer a little better than I would.
Well, there's some accessories. There are some accessories that will hold the filters for you, and so you might be able to stack them in there. The other alternative, well, with the other alternative would be to use a square filter, and then you can just stack them in front of your lens, not necessarily attach them to the lens. So there's a couple different ways to do that. So if you want to give us a call during the day, one of the folks at the office would be happy to walk you through the best way to do that on your camera. And then someone also said Singh-Ray is now selling thin filters that have front threads. They told me a couple of weeks ago.
And those are the filters that I own.
we're making new products and new sizes and new things all of the time. So check on the website. Whenever those are ready, they'll be available for sale on the website, or just give us a call and we'll talk to you about it.
Okay.
Oh, and then Laura, sorry, Laura is on the line from Florida. Laura works in the Singh-Ray office there in Florida, and she said we are currently working on getting our filters to have front threads, and that will remedy that problem. So it's in the works.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
so back to
I don't know how I got them, but I have the ones with the front thread. Maybe because I got them when I actually went to the office, but I don't
got the
remember.
prototype.
Yeah. But yeah, I do stack them, but most of the time I don't need to, and which is why I carry the 5-stop, the 10-stop, and the very ND. The only time I've ever stacked filters is when I've stacked the 5 and the 10-stop, which is what I used to photograph the solar eclipse a month or so ago, and that's the only time I really needed to stack them. But and it worked just fine. Okay. So photographing reflections is kind of cool as well. I really enjoy that. And with motion and reflections, it can kind of create this really cool juxtaposition where I have, especially in this particular image, where I have one part of the image where the water is absolutely static and I'm getting a clear reflection, while in other parts of the image, the water is moving through, but I'm getting a very strong reflection of just the color of the trees. And that's just because the water is moving, so it can't reflect it as clearly. But the color does come through, and this effect is best achieved when the water is in the shade, but what's actually reflecting in the water, so in this case, the trees with the fall color, is actually in bright sunlight. Those are the ideal and best conditions that you'll get very strong reflections in the water, whether it's moving or whether it's static. And as you can see in this particular image as well. Again, 2.5 seconds was enough in this case, using the more slow 5-stop filter. Again, these are fairly bright conditions I'm working in, even though I'm in the shade. And I'm able to still get a 2.5 second exposure.
Would those same techniques apply? Someone asked about using ND filters for shooting ice or icy surfaces. So do some of these same techniques apply from this photo that would for the ice?
Well, it depends. Now, if the ice is, and I actually have a photo of some ice moving, and it's coming up. Okay. But generally with ice, it depends on what kind of ice it is. If it's floating on the water and kind of drifting across, or if it's just static ice. If it's just static ice, you don't really need an ND filter to get the reflection. The ND filter was really used here just because the water was moving. So I wanted to get that smoothness and bring more color into it and have less texture in the water. That's the reason the ND filter was used in this case. So with ice, again, it would be hard for me to say, but generally if the ice is not moving, if you're just photographing reflections on the ice, then no, you don't need an ND filter to get strong reflections. But that same concept of having the ice in the shade and what is reflecting in the ice in bright sunlight would still apply. Okay, so it's a fun situation to be in, really, and I really like the juxtaposition of, the standard waterfall in the background and this swirling pool in the foreground. If you're wondering what was swirling in this pool, it was just foam bubbles. Foam bubbles generally look pretty ugly when you just look at them, but you add a little motion to them, and over 8 seconds, I was able to get this kind of swirly effect. And I tried different shutter speeds here. I actually started off around 2-3 seconds with a standard, I think it was about 2 seconds with a standard circular polarizer, and I was not getting the effect I wanted. I wanted the foam bubbles to literally kind of disappear and become lines like they have become in this particular image. So using the 5-stop filter helped me pull the exposure to 8 seconds and gave me the effect I wanted. And remember that these are things that you can't have a formula for them, because in some places I've photographed foam bubbles, they're moving slower, and in some places they're moving faster. So it's not like 8 seconds will give you the exact same effect. Doesn't matter what foam bubbles you're photographing. It just depends on the situation. So you kind of have to get a sense of uh, what you want, and then kind of and with digital photography, one of the best things is you can take a shot and you can take a look and you can make the adjustment.
So with that type of a picture where you've got water swirling in one place and falling in another, is this one of those times where you kind of can't get the shot without a filter, or are there ways to create that effect using software only after the fact, or is that just something you would probably not want to spend time doing? It's a loaded question.
So yeah, the short answer is yes, you need the filter to create this effect, because in software you would not be able to get the exact effect. And also I do realize that a lot of people use software to kind of create something. My approach is more in camera. So the more I can do in the camera, I feel like that's what I enjoy. I enjoy being out in the field, not in front of the computer. So
Right.
my approach tends to focus more on field work rather than trying to rely on software to get the effect I want. Not to say that I don't use software, of course.
Right.
It's essential to give you the final product. But as far as creating that swirl in software, yes, it could be done, but it's going to be a lot of work, or you're going to have to take it from another photo and add it in and stuff. And I don't know how that would look. So
Right.
personally, I would not have taken this photograph if I was not able, or I would not have showed this photograph if I was not able to get the effect in the water that I wanted.
Right. See, I look at things the opposite direction, I think, because professionally, I spend a good part of my day in Adobe editing software. And for me, photography is the hobby. So I look at it the other way around. And I think to myself, that would be probably multiple days in Photoshop and all of the Adobe programs in and out to create that effect. So that's why I asked the question, because I'm thinking in my head, if I had to recreate that, I wouldn't want to do it. I wouldn't want that job.
Right. Yeah, and it's to each his own. I don't tell people don't do it, and I don't tell them it has to be done in camera. There
Right.
are always options. It's your choice as to what you want to spend your time doing. Whether you want to be in the field or whether you want to be on the computer. So that's totally up to the person behind the lens.
Right. Okay. Great.
So this was the image I was talking about with ice. So in the previous image, I obviously had a really nice background. That waterfall, the rocks in the background were great. So I was using the swirl as a lead into the photograph. In this case, the swirl is the subject really, and I thought it was kind of fun with a little bit of the reflections in there as well. But this was taken in Yosemite. It's actually called frazzle ice. So the way it works is if the temperature is well below freezing and it allows the top of the river to freeze, this ice forms, and then during the day as it melts, then the ice starts to flow in the river. So it's a very unique thing that happens at Yosemite. I'm sure it happens in other locations. That's where I've seen it. And this was taken there. And I just liked this one area where the ice was getting stuck and basically swirling around and around. And I just tried various, I used the variable ND filter, I used the 10 stop, and I found 10 stops I was getting almost no texture. It became almost too smooth. So in the end, I ended up using the 5 stop and got the effect that I wanted with a little bit of texture in there, but enough motion to make it interesting. And if you notice, there was a question about that ISO before. This is at ISO 50. So here, this particular photograph, the dynamic range is not very big. It's not that much of an issue. I don't have very dark areas and very bright areas. So in this case, and I've also gone to f22. So there's two things I'm doing here, which I just said that I don't do very often. And I went to ISO 50, so I was using a camera that the base ISO is 100. So by going to the lowest ISO, the low setting, at ISO 50, I was able to get the effect that I wanted. And I'm also shooting this at f/22. Now, when you look at this image, what is sharp in the photograph? Not a whole lot. So in situations like this, being at f/16 or worrying too much about the sharpness, it's not really an issue for me. And I was fine if my lens actually allowed me to go below f/22. I would have probably even done that, because everything is movement in this particular image. There's no sharp area that I need to maintain. Okay, so here's a very extreme example. That is not a typo. That is 267 seconds, the exposure. And you're probably going to be like, well, why in the world would I take a 267-second exposure? And how did I come up with 267? Well, the exact exposure, I'd kind of, that's about 4.5 minutes if you're trying to calculate that. So I had in my mind that it needed to be at over 4 minutes to get the effect that I wanted. The effect that I wanted was the motion in the sky. That's the reason this had to be over 4 minutes. Those clouds were not moving very fast. They're moving very slowly. I could tell which direction they're going in, but they're moving extremely slowly. So if you have fast moving clouds, you could achieve the same effect, maybe even with a 30-second exposure, but they'd have to be really moving. The water would not have rendered very differently. Even at 30 seconds, I would have got a similar look to this particular waterfall. But really what I was going for was the sky, and that's why it had to be over 4 minutes. And if you notice, I have the ISO at 200 over there, and this is taken already in twilight conditions, so the light is very low anyway. So I'm using the more slow 10 stop to give me this really long exposure. And for those of you who are wondering how to calculate an exposure like this, because you obviously don't have the time to sit there for 4 minutes and then be like, oh, this is way underexposed, and oh, this is way overexposed. So the way I do it, I use a little app called Long Exposure Calculator. And there, if you go to the App Store, I'm using the iPhone, but I'm sure on Android they have apps as well that do something like this. There's a few that I use. The one I use specifically is called Long Exposure Calculator. I just like that better just because I like the interface. And what that does, what this app does is you tell it the exposure. So essentially the exposure that you captured without the ND filter. Okay. And then you say, I'm going to put 5 stops or 10 stops or 15 stops, and it gives you the resulting, it calculates for you and gives you the resulting shutter speed. And so I find that very useful. So that way you can just say, oh, what will my shutter speed need to be for a good exposure at, f/16 ISO 200 with a 10 stop filter. And that's how I kind of came up with that. And remember, it's not super, once you get to those seriously long exposures that are in minutes, you don't have to, if the app is telling you it needs to be 4 minutes, you don't have to stop it exactly at 4 minutes. You can stop it, 10 seconds here and there. It's not going to make that much of a difference to your exposure, just because it is such a long exposure. It's not going to make too much of a difference. However, be careful when you're photographing. If the light is changing considerably, that could be an issue. And that's why this was taken in twilight conditions where the light was not changing very fast. And this is taken in Iceland in the summer, where the light changes extremely slow compared to the way it is in the United States. Even in the winter, it goes much faster. Was there a question?
Just a quick note on time. We've got about 15 minutes until the top of the hour. So.
Okay. Yep, I'll speed it along a little bit. Okay, so here I just wanted to show you I've still used the variable ND filter, and this is water in a different form. So that's just steam kind of coming off these geysers, and taken at f8, half a second exposure at ISO 200. I'm using the ND filter. but I'm not liking the effect. So what did I do? I just dialed it in all the way, and I was able to stretch it to a 6-second exposure. And now I got this really ethereal feel, and I love the motion that's been captured in the steam. And again, I didn't know what it's going to look like. I'm dialing it in, taking a shot, taking a look. Again, these are not super long exposures. I can wait 5 seconds and it gives me the results. So there's enough room for experimentation in situations like this. And it was a good thing that there was a lot of breeze, which is why the steam is going right across versus going straight up. So here's another example of steam, and this is actually taken in Yellowstone. And I deliberately angled myself so I can get this really dark background. So I have this cliff on the other side, but by angling myself so that the light is hitting, essentially backlighting the steam, but I'm getting a dark background behind that is the key here, so I can get the texture that I'm getting in the steam. And this is very slow. This is not taken on a windy day. It's very calm. So the steam is rising extremely slowly. And that's why even at 5 seconds, you see so much texture in this particular photograph. And I wanted to show this next photograph. This is one of the several photographs I took during that particular shoot. And if you look at the things on the right, or the items on the right side, number one is flare. That's something you have to be very careful of. With the longer exposures, flare tends to build up or sometimes even look worse. But if you look at the top here, there's a little circle. That's because of the sun kind of hitting the front element. And of course, all this weird color that I'm getting is also because of that sun hitting the front element. I did actually, for this particular exposure, I did use my hand to block as much of that as I possibly could. But one of the reasons I went to the black and white conversion is because I felt like, it was a little more dramatic, but also I didn't have to deal with the color shift that was happening because of the flare. Light leak is another issue, especially with really long exposures. You got to make sure that, and the light leak is essentially referring to the light coming in through your viewfinder. So when you do long exposures, once they go above a few seconds, and even a few seconds, I usually try to cover the viewfinder with my hand. Generally, you want to give yourself, either if you're using a pro body, you have the option to kind of close the viewfinder altogether, or just keep your hand behind so that there's no light kind of coming through. Some people even like to use like a little black cloth or something like that. That works pretty well as well. So here's, there was that question about getting that kind of vignette or that cross that kind of comes in when you're using a variable ND filter. Okay, so if you've used a polarizing filter on a super wide angle lens, it's almost that same effect if you do it with the sky. In a polarizer, you'll find that one part of your sky is darker than the other, and it's kind of working the same way. No filter is perfect. Every filter has its use. There's no do-it-all filter, like there's no do-it-all camera or do-it-all lens. We have specific tools to do different things. And you have to understand the limitations of a particular filter to know when to use it. So in this case, I wanted to show you, this is at 6 seconds at 24 mm. This happens with a variable ND filter when you're using it on a wide angle lens. So at 24 mm, I'm fairly wide. Once you get to about 50 mm, this disappears. So this is essentially a result of the focal length, or is pronounced because of the focal length. The issue is essentially not visible at all. Once you get to 50 mm and beyond, I don't see it at all. And you can dial it in as much as you want. So if you're using a wide angle lens, the variable ND filter is not recommended. I don't recommend it. At least not using it at its maximum 8 stops. That's when you want to use your 5-stop more slow or 10 stop more slow filters. That's what those are made for, with the thin ring as well. And the next image actually shows you, I'm still using the same filter, but you notice it's now 1.6 seconds. You notice that on the right side here. And that's the best, or the most I could get out of this particular filter. And so I don't have that effect of the X, or the effect of the dark areas coming into the particular image. I still see a little bit of that filter actually, and that's actually the physical filter on the two edges showing through. Now that's easily done. You can crop that. That's not an issue, as long as you know that's happening. But eventually I realized that this was not the right filter. I had started with it thinking that it might work, but really I wanted to get a much longer exposure. And I also did another thing. I changed my perspective. So, and also I should say that this photo obviously looks a lot better than these ones. These are kind of unprocessed as well. These are almost straight out of the camera, very basic processing. This one is fully processed. So I've gone through my full raw workflow with this particular image. So I changed the perspective. I changed my filter. I'm now using a more slow 10-stop filter. You see I'm at 30 seconds, and that's the exposure I wanted to be. So in this case, when I dropped that filter on, I knew I had to be at f13 and ISO 200. So I've deviated a little bit from those usual starting settings that I have, which is f16 and my base ISO, which on this camera would have been ISO 100. But compositional considerations kind of drove me to move I changed my perspective to this, and I felt like this really captured what I was going for with the rugged coastline and the depth in the photograph a lot better than that other location.
We did have a question about the more slow filter. They wanted to know if you ever have a problem with color shift when you're using the more slow filters with a 16 to 20 millimeter, and
Okay.
how do you deal with it?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And if you notice, it's been used in this particular image, but I did not have a color shift. It's pretty accurate in terms of what I saw. Yes, that does occur, and that's not really a result of, and some people say some brands have that issue. The Singh-Ray filters I use give me the best results that I have seen, but not to say that other filters can give you that. The issue happens more when the light is lower. And the lower the light, the harder it is for the white balance to be more accurate, is what I have found. I find that when you're photographing in brighter light, you don't get as much of a color shift. Usually in brighter light, it's fixable. It might be just a little bit, and you can always tweak that. I'm shooting all my photos in the raw format, so you can always tweak that a little bit later on. But generally, that can be an issue, and that's a result of having as much as 10 stops in front of your lens. If you can't see out of your lens because that's the amount of density that you're using, your camera sees the same thing that you're seeing, so it's not able to detect as well. So especially if you're using like auto white balance or something like that, it's a very strong likelihood that you will get a little bit of a color shift. But most of the time it's fixable. Again, my fallback, if it's simply not fixable, but I really like the composition and the effect I achieved, it's kind of like a fallback to just go to a black and white conversion and work with that. So here's another example. And the reason I'm just showing you these is all taken with a more slow 10 stop. This was 30 seconds. This is 13 seconds. And this one is 20 seconds. And they all try to take them at about the same settings in terms of the f-stop and the ISO, but the light is very different in all three situations. So that kind of determines the shutter speed, and that's kind of what I was going for. In this case, I was just kind of trying to get that softness in the water crashing up on the rocks. Here I wanted to there was that little bit of fog and clouds kind of moving through. You see in the background. I wanted to get that soft feel to that, along with getting a very soft feel to the water without losing too much texture. So in bright conditions, using ND filters can be very useful. And I'm almost down to my last 5 or 6 photos here, so I'll kind of go through them quickly and then try and answer whatever questions are at the end. So I like to use the ND filters in bright light because you can get some really unusual effects with them. And this is kind of an example of one of them where I'm shooting this, my camera is static, but the water is moving and I'm breaking on those rocks there. And I'm trying to capture essentially the backlit waves as they splash on the rocks. And I'm able to get this really cool texture out of that. And about 1 second was good enough in this situation. And again, it depends on how fast the water is moving. But generally 1 second would be a good starting point for if you wanted to do something like this. So it's not every time that your photo has to have a slow shutter speed. So this is taken without a filter. And I think this captured this particular scene best. I eventually did put a filter on this, the more slow 10-stop filter, and take this photograph. But when I looked at this particular image, I really felt like this was capturing the scene a lot better than my filter was, or my photo was with the filter on. So in some situations, it's better not to use the filter. You just got to know when that situation arrives and make that decision quickly. But again, you can always give yourself options. Take one with, take one without. And that shouldn't be a default thing you do, but if you have the time, it's not a bad idea. This is taken just with a circular polarizer, just to give you an example of getting a 1 second exposure, static camera on a tripod. This is almost the same settings, but now I've taken it off the tripod and now I'm moving the camera. So because the light is pretty low, this is really early in the morning, I'm able to achieve this effect by just moving the camera, hand holding the camera. This is panning with the waves. Now here I've put a very ND on. I'm using it at its very minimal setting, which is 2 stops, just so that I can kind of pan with the waves. And at a half a second, as you can tell, the light has become a lot brighter. And so I needed the variable ND filter to get to that half a second exposure. And here I'm just having fun with abstracts. You notice it's at f16 ISO 64. I need it to be only at 1/4 of a second, but when the light is extremely bright, you'll be surprised that even if you go to f16 on your base ISO, you're not going to be able to get a fast or a slower shutter speed. So I just popped the very ND on again at the minimum setting, two stops, and and if you're wondering what this is, it is water. Those are foam bubbles, and the highlights are kind of rendering as streaks because I'm moving the camera. So just some fun stuff that you can do as well. And this is an example of what you can have before, and then you put a 10-stop filter on and you totally transform the scene. Now, some people might say, oh, that looks like a pretty good shot by itself, and that's fine. It depends on what you're going for, and I've seen this kind of shot a lot from Yosemite, so I wanted to try and do something a little different, and the 10-stop filter allowed me to get a much longer exposure. As you can see, 30 seconds here to get the effect that I wanted. And here you can, this is the last image here. I wanted to kind of show this image at the end because it kind of puts both those things together. You have a waterfall, so you see the effect of 10 seconds in the waterfall, but you also see the effect of the 10 seconds on the clouds moving through. So instead of getting a lot of texture in the clouds, it's almost become fog-like. And so it really is, it depends on your own imagination, how you choose to use the filters and when to use them. Keep thinking about how much light you have. And if you need to use the app to get the shutter speeds that you want. Well, just to kind of sign off with a couple of tips here. Generally, about 1 to 4 seconds will give you a lot of texture in your photos, especially with water. from about 4 to 10 seconds, it starts to smoothen out, but you still get a little bit of texture. Once you go beyond 10 seconds, again, it depends on how fast the water is moving, but it tends to start smoothing out very fast. And about 30 seconds, you're getting extremely smooth exposure on water. So hope that was helpful. Happy to answer any more questions. Thank you so much.
Okay. We did have a few other questions come through. Francis wants to know, a polarizer is recommended when photographing water. Do you combine a polarizer with the very ND filter?
No, actually I don't. I have on occasions, but most of the time I don't. And polarizing filter is really recommended for water just only in situations where you need to take a little bit of the glare off the water. That's the main reason people say you should use a polarizer to use when you're photographing water. But if you don't want to remove the flare, I'm sorry, I said flare. I meant the glare on the water. You don't have to use a polarizer. Now I know Singh-Ray makes a combo filter that is an ND and polarizing filter. I don't have that particular filter. It sounds very interesting. I might actually try it. But I find that I don't use those two filters very much together. And if I wanted to, I do have the option to stack them. And I have done that on some occasions, but it's not something I do enough of where I feel like I need to have that particular filter that does both.
And then this goes back, I believe, to the thin filters. Which one do you prefer, threaded or the square ones? And what are the advantages of one over the other?
Aha, that's a really good question. So I prefer the screw-on filters because there's absolutely no chance of light leak happening. With the square filters, you got to be very careful. You got to make sure that they're snug and right up against the front. And I find the square filters rather cumbersome to use, so I stick with the screw-on filters. But the primary reason for that is light leak, and I find that I'm never going to have an issue with light leak if I have the screw-on filter, because it's tightly on, it's as close as it needs to be, it's flush. While I've found that from other friends and clients who use these square filters having some problems with light leak. And again, there's so many manufacturers, so one might be better than the other. I'm not as familiar with all of those, but I've usually stayed away from those just because of that reason.
And then we had a question about halo, and then you talked about vignetting. Is that the same thing, or is there another sort of halo effect that can happen?
I guess I don't know how they're describing halo, but I was thinking what they meant by halo was just the vignetting at the edges. That's what I thought it was, or maybe that little X that happens with the wide angle lens and the variable filter. So I'm not sure what exactly halo means, but generally, yeah, those are the two issues that you can have. Is if the filter is thick, you can actually see the physical filter on the very edges of the photo. Again, very easily fixed by simply cropping the image. If that's an issue, go to a thin ring and use the solid filter versus the variable.
Okay. And so I think, Jeffrey, it looks like that answered your question. If not, give us a specific example of where you were and what you were photographing and the halo effect. We have a couple more in here. If you own a super wide angle like the Nikon 14-24, what filter system are you using?
Yeah, so I'm actually hoping Nikon releases a 16-35 2.8 soon. It's been rumored for a while. I'm currently using that 14-24, but I don't use any filters on it at all. I kind of get by right now. And the way I get by is I shoot in really low light, and I'm using my 810 to kind of shoot at ISO 32 or thereabouts, and stretch as much as I can with the low light and the low ISO. But I find that, as I said, the square filters are what are necessary to be used with the Nikon 40-24. I do not use them right now. I'm waiting for them to come up with a wide angle that will let me use screw-on filters, because I prefer those.
Right. And then Carl said, I have a Singh-Ray thin polarizer, but it cannot accommodate a hard cap. The friction cap keeps falling off. Has this been fixed? So Laura, I think that's a Singh-Ray question. If you're still here and you want to chime in with the answer, he wants to know about the friction cap falling off and have we come up with a solution. So hopefully Laura's still here and she'll give us back an answer. Carol wants to know, do you use graduated ND filters?
No, I actually don't. Those were very popular when the dynamic range on the digital cameras was not as good. Nowadays with the D810 and some other cameras, and D850 now, you're getting upwards of 11 and 12 stops, which is a lot more than the cameras were giving you before. When I first started with digital photography, around 8 stops was what I was getting with a Nikon D70 camera, I believe. So it's a huge difference, and I find that I'm able to pull out so much in the raw file by just simply exposing to the right, you know, pushing my histogram as far right as possible without getting any blinking highlights or any spikes in my histogram. So I'm essentially not overexposing, but I'm pushing as much of the data as I can into the highlights. I'm able to get the most optimal image, which then allows me to bring out the shadows and not have to use a graduated filter. And one of the other reasons I don't use one in the field is because, you know, the horizon is never always straight, and your graduated filter is essentially, you know, it's graduated, but it's essentially the gradient is in a straight line. It doesn't compensate for a tree sticking up over the horizon or something like that. So in situations where the dynamic range is simply that high, where I can't get the exposure, I either need to expose for the sky or my foreground. Then in those situations, I'll take 2 exposures. I'll take one for the sky and expose for the sky, and then take another exposure, letting the sky blow out or whatever, and get the right exposure for my foreground, and then put them together using Photoshop and layers and mask out, you know, the sky and replace it with the sky from the other photo. But remember, for doing something like that, you have to have it on a tripod, and your camera shouldn't move at all. So that's my way of kind of getting over the dynamic range issue rather than using a filter in the field.
Right. And then an answer back to Carl about the caps and the threads. We are including push-on caps for the thin mounts when they purchase them until we get the front thread issue resolved. So we have a workaround. Give us a call during the day, but we are including that with new purchases. So give us a call during the day and let us know, and possibly we can work with you on that. Like these as answered. And then the app you mentioned, Keith looked in the Google Play Store and he said he doesn't see a long exposure calculator. Do you know who the maker is of that app?
Oh, I am not sure, but I'm sure there are others. I know this. Let me take a quick look. I'll give you, let me see if I can find that really quick.
It's spelled funny. Sometimes if you take the spaces out.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. The person who's asking this question, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to respond via email. I can't look it up fast enough. I don't want to hold everybody here.
So, and then while we have this last slide up here, definitely check out the Singh-Ray website for upcoming webinars. It's sing-ray.com/webinars, and all of the future webinars are going to be listed up there as we lock down new speakers for them. For more information about Singh-Ray filters, call us. We're located in Florida on the Eastern Time Zone. You can call us at 863-993-4100 or send an email to info@sing-ray.com. Or just check out the website. And for information about Nikhil Bahl and his work, his website is just hisname.com, NIKHILBAHL.com. And we've got a couple of questions here coming through still. Lots of people saying thank you and they enjoyed the webinar.
Yeah, glad to hear it. Thank you. Thanks for coming in.
And somebody answered about the calculator. Check out jcorrales.com, JCORALES.com.
And by the way, there are several different apps. I've seen them. You just have to do a search and you should be able to find them. But if anybody's looking for that specific app that I use, again, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you the information I have.
Right. And then another question, are you using the gold and blue filter? And if so, in which situations typically?
That's a tricky filter. I have used it before. I owned it for a short time. It's a very specialty filter. I don't think it's something that can be used very often. In some situations, it can be absolutely amazing. And I've seen photos where it just makes it look absolutely bizarre. So it just depends on, how much of an effect that you want on your photograph. I personally, I found that it was too much of an effect for me. I'm kind of inspired by what I see. So to change something up by, using that gold blue filter, I felt it was sometimes a little too far out there for me. So I don't use that, but be aware that that doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. However, that is definitely a specialty filter that you will use on some occasions and have success with a small amount of time versus, using something like an ND or a polarizer, which you'll use much more often.
And then Christina gave us a tip on the vignetting and the haloing. She says some photographers are using step-up rings and a larger size ND slim filter to help solve the vignetting problem. So take a look at step-up rings and a larger size ND slim filter for that issue.
Yes, I'm glad that was brought up, because there's one disadvantage to that, is you can't put your hood, the lens hood on if you do that, and you're going to run into some issues with flare. So, yes, you can kind of get around that, and I get around it by using the thin filters, but I have seen people get around it by using the step-up rings, but those can have more issues with flare than you would if you have the lens hood on. So again, see what works for you. If you don't care about the flare so much, or if you feel like you can handle it with your hat or your hand, then it might work for you, but it won't work in all situations. So just be aware of that.
And I got a note from Laura, and I think she's talking about the gold and blue. Let me know if I'm wrong, Laura. But she said some people choose to use it in black and white.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah. So it'll do all this crazy stuff with the color, but if you convert to the black and white, you'll still get some effect in there, because remember, with black and white, especially if you're photographing raw, you're still capturing all the color information. So when you work with black and white and the tools, you still have like a color mix to work with, so you can still tweak colors, etc. So it could be useful for that. I never really thought of that, so that's a good idea.
And then Jim wants to know, he missed the first few minutes of the webinar. Is there a replay option available? And if you are here on the webinar, then definitely you are going to get an email from us with a link to watch the video. Anyone who's registered before we got started, whether it's here or not, is going to get that. but obviously the only way to answer all these great questions is live. So we hope that you will come back and join us live every month. Oh, and Danielle, thank you. Danielle said, Nikhil seems very knowledgeable and has given an excellent and informative presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
He says he did a great job in communicating some difficult concepts. So,
cool.
Folks, I think that's it for the questions coming through here. If anything comes to mind later that you didn't get a chance to ask, send it to info@sing-ray.com. Just info@singray.com, and we will do our best to answer it ourselves or put you in touch with Nikhil and he can answer it for you. Oh, thank you. Rosemary says she enjoyed the presentation a lot. So I'm going to close it here, but thank you so much for being our presenter today.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I'm glad to hear there was some positive feedback at the end as well.
Yeah. So everyone join us back next month, and you'll get a copy of this via email probably about this time tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.